8 sentences have been considered by psychologists to probably be the greatest collection of wisdom ever packaged by a single philosopher.
Robert Schuller built one of the most recognizable ministries in the world. He pioneered a style of preaching that inspired millions, created a television empire that reached more than 150 countries, and constructed one of the most famous church buildings ever built, the Crystal Cathedral. For decades, he seemed untouchable. Politicians sought his advice, celebrities attended his services, and supporters viewed him as a visionary who had transformed modern Christianity. But behind the gleaming glass walls and positive messages was a story headed toward disaster. By the end of his life, Schuller had been removed from his own ministry, watched his family turn against one another, testified against the church he founded, and saw his life's work sold away. This is the story of how it all happened: bankruptcy and the collapse of an empire. In July 2010, Robert Schuller's daughter, Sheila Schuller Coleman, stepped into leadership with promises of stability and renewal. She assured supporters that Crystal Cathedral Ministries could recover from the turmoil that had plagued the organization. Many hoped she would reunite the fractured family and restore confidence among church members and donors. Those hopes were short-lived. Only 3 months after taking control, Sheila announced that Crystal Cathedral Ministries was filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The news stunned supporters around the world. For decades, the Crystal Cathedral had appeared to symbolize financial strength and organizational success. Few imagined the ministry was facing such severe financial trouble. The bankruptcy filings revealed a much darker reality. The organization was carrying tens of millions of dollars in debt. Perhaps most shocking was the discovery that the Crystal Cathedral campus, once proudly built debt-free, had been mortgaged. Robert Schuller had often taught that churches should avoid borrowing money whenever possible. Yet somewhere along the way, the ministry had abandoned that principle. The financial problems had been building for years. The Great Recession of 2008 had dramatically reduced charitable giving across the country. At the same time, Hour of Power was losing viewers. The generation that had faithfully watched Schuller every Sunday was aging. Many longtime supporters had passed away or could no longer contribute financially. Younger audiences were not replacing them at the same rate. Meanwhile, the cost of maintaining a global television ministry remained enormous. Broadcasting to hundreds of stations around the world required millions of dollars. As revenue declined, expenses continued piling up. The consequences were devastating. More than 100 employees lost their jobs. Musicians, singers, and production staff who had dedicated years to the ministry were dismissed. The famous orchestra was disbanded. Long-standing holiday productions that had attracted visitors from around the world were canceled. For the first time in decades, the ministry could no longer sustain the image it had carefully cultivated. As court documents became public, another controversy emerged. Reports revealed that several members of the Schuller family had received substantial compensation from the ministry over the years. Critics questioned whether financial decisions had been made in the organization's best interests. Supporters defended the family, arguing that they had devoted their lives to building the ministry. The family conflict only intensified. In 2011, Sheila Schuller Coleman removed her own father from the ministry's board. Robert Schuller and his wife, Arvella, found themselves pushed aside from the organization they had spent more than half a century creating. The situation became even more dramatic when Robert Schuller filed a multi-million-dollar claim against Crystal Cathedral Ministries. He argued that the ministry owed him compensation for intellectual property associated with his books, sermons, and personal brand. In a stunning development, the founder of the ministry was now testifying against the organization in bankruptcy court. To many observers, the scene was heartbreaking. The family that had once represented unity and faith on television was now locked in public legal battles. The ministry that had inspired millions was fighting for survival, while relatives argued over money, leadership, and legacy. By 2012, the organization was running out of options. The empire was collapsing, and there appeared to be no way to stop it. From farm boy to television pioneer. Long before Robert Schuller became a household name, he was a farm boy growing up in rural Iowa. Born in 1926 in the small town of Alton, he spent his childhood during the Great Depression. His family lived without many modern conveniences and worked hard simply to survive. The struggles of those years would leave a lasting impression on him. Schuller often spoke about how faith and optimism helped his family endure difficult circumstances. Those lessons became the foundation of the message he would later preach to millions. After studying for ministry, Schuller was ordained in the Reformed Church in America. In 1955, he received an assignment that seemed almost impossible. He was sent to Southern California with the task of starting a new church. He had no congregation, no building, and very little money. Most pastors would have viewed the situation as overwhelming. Schuller saw an opportunity. Instead of waiting for people to come to church, he decided to bring church to where people already were. He rented a drive-in movie theater in Garden Grove and began preaching from the roof of the snack bar. Families remained in their cars during the service and honked their horns instead of saying amen. It was unconventional, but it worked. People who felt uncomfortable in traditional churches found the drive-in atmosphere welcoming and accessible. The congregation grew rapidly. Schuller understood something many churches had overlooked. There were thousands of people who were interested in faith but intimidated by traditional church culture. His message was simple, encouraging, and focused on hope rather than condemnation. Week after week, more people showed up. Within a few years, the drive-in church had become one of the fastest-growing congregations in California. The success allowed Schuller to think bigger. In 1961, he raised millions of dollars to build a permanent church facility. The striking modern structure immediately attracted attention. It was unlike anything most Americans associated with church architecture. Schuller's ambitions continued to grow. In 1970, he launched a television program called Hour of Power. The decision would change everything. Encouraged by evangelist Billy Graham, Schuller embraced television as the future of ministry. The program eventually expanded across the globe, reaching millions of viewers every week. Through Hour of Power, Robert Schuller became one of the most recognizable religious figures in America. His message of possibility thinking emphasized confidence, personal growth, and faith in God's ability to transform lives. Critics accused him of avoiding difficult topics such as sin and repentance, but supporters appreciated his positive approach. Regardless of the criticism, audiences continued to grow, and Schuller was quickly becoming a religious superstar, building the Crystal Cathedral dream. By the late 1970s, Robert Schuller had already achieved something few pastors could even imagine. His Hour of Power television program was reaching millions of viewers. His congregation continued to grow, and his influence stretched far beyond Southern California. Yet success created a new challenge. The facilities that had once seemed enormous were no longer large enough to accommodate the crowds attending services or the expanding demands of a global television ministry. Schuller believed that if his ministry was going to continue growing, it needed a new home, one that would reflect the scale of his vision. Rather than build a conventional church, Schuller dreamed of creating something the world had never seen before. He wanted a sanctuary that would inspire awe the moment people entered. His vision was for a building that blurred the boundary between worship and nature, allowing congregants to feel connected to God's creation while still gathered in a sacred space. To make that dream a reality, Schuller turned to renowned architect Philip Johnson, one of the most celebrated designers in America. Together, they developed plans for what would become the Crystal Cathedral. The project was unlike any church construction effort of its time. Featuring more than 10,000 panes of reflective glass, the structure appeared almost impossible to build. Critics questioned whether such an ambitious design could ever be completed successfully. But Schuller pressed forward, convinced that the cathedral would become a symbol of possibility and faith. When the Crystal Cathedral officially opened in 1981, it immediately captured worldwide attention. Bathed in natural sunlight and surrounded by walls of glass, the sanctuary created the feeling of worshiping beneath the open sky. The breathtaking design transformed the building into one of the most recognizable churches in the world. With seating for more than 2,200 worshippers and the massive Hazelwright organ, one of the largest pipe organs in the Western Hemisphere, the cathedral became a landmark of both architecture and ministry. Perhaps the achievement Schuller was most proud of was how the project had been financed. The $18 million structure was completed without debt. No mortgage, no loans, and no lingering financial obligations. Schuller frequently pointed to this accomplishment as evidence that faith, careful planning, and responsible stewardship could work together to achieve extraordinary goals. The Crystal Cathedral soon became much more than a local church. It evolved into an international destination. Every Easter and Christmas, elaborate productions filled the sanctuary with live animals, flying angels, Roman soldiers, and massive theatrical sets. Thousands of visitors purchased tickets to witness these spectacular events, which combined biblical storytelling with Hollywood-style production values. The performances became beloved traditions and helped solidify the cathedral's reputation as one of America's most unique worship centers. At its height, Crystal Cathedral Ministries employed hundreds of staff members and served a congregation exceeding 10,000 members. The Hour of Power broadcast reached audiences in more than 150 countries, making Schuller one of the most recognizable religious leaders on the planet. Donations flowed steadily, television ratings remained strong, and Schuller regularly appeared alongside presidents, celebrities, and international leaders. Few pastors had ever built an organization with such influence and visibility. For nearly 3 decades, the formula appeared unstoppable. The congregation grew, the broadcasts expanded, and the Crystal Cathedral stood as a monument to success. Yet, hidden beneath the growth was a vulnerability few people recognized. The ministry had become closely tied to one man. Robert Schuller was not simply the leader, he was the brand, the voice, and the public face of the entire organization. As long as he remained at the center, the system thrived. But an uncomfortable question lingered in the background. What would happen when Robert Schuller was no longer there to lead it? The beginning of the family civil war. In 2006, Robert Schuller reached a milestone that many religious leaders never achieve. After more than 5 decades of building one of the most recognizable ministries in the world, he announced his retirement at the age of 80. The decision marked the end of an era for Crystal Cathedral Ministries and the globally broadcast Hour of Power program. For supporters, however, there was little concern about the future. The succession plan appeared straightforward. Schuller's son, Robert A. Schuller, had spent years working within the ministry and seemed well-positioned to carry his father's vision into the next generation. At first, the transition appeared promising. The younger Schuller was familiar with the organization, understood its audience, and had been preparing for leadership for years. Many church members expected a seamless handoff from father to son. Instead, what was intended to secure the ministry's future became the beginning of a family conflict that would eventually help unravel the entire organization. Almost immediately, differences emerged between the two men. Robert A. Schuller believed the ministry needed to evolve if it hoped to remain relevant in a rapidly changing world. Television audiences were shrinking, Younger generations were consuming media differently, and church culture was undergoing significant transformation. He wanted to modernize the presentation of Hour of Power, refresh the ministry's image, and adapt its approach to connect with a new audience. His father saw things differently. Robert Schuller had spent decades building the ministry into a global brand. The Hour of Power formula had brought extraordinary success, reaching millions of viewers around the world. From his perspective, the ministry's strength came from consistency, and changing too much risked alienating the loyal audience that had supported it for decades. What began as a disagreement about strategy gradually evolved into a struggle over control, direction, and legacy. Behind closed doors, tensions escalated. Meetings became increasingly contentious, and staff members found themselves trapped between competing visions. Longtime employees who had dedicated years, and in some cases decades, to the ministry were forced to choose sides. Relationships that had been built over a lifetime began to fracture under the pressure. The conflict finally became public in 2008, when Robert Schuller removed his own son from leadership. The decision shocked church members, television viewers, and ministry supporters across the country. A succession plan that had seemed carefully designed had collapsed in just 2 years, exposing deep divisions within the Schuller family. The fallout extended far beyond the father-son relationship. Other family members became involved, creating rival factions within the ministry. Board meetings turned into battlegrounds, trust eroded, and key staff members resigned. Donors who had faithfully supported the ministry for years began asking difficult questions about its future. For the first time in decades, Crystal Cathedral Ministries appeared vulnerable. Attendance declined, contributions slowed, and the carefully maintained image of a united family leading a thriving ministry began to crumble. Yet, while the public focused on the family drama, an even more serious crisis was developing behind the scenes. Financial pressures were mounting, debts were increasing, and the empire Robert Schuller had spent a lifetime building was quietly moving toward collapse, losing the cathedral he built. As the bankruptcy proceedings dragged on, Crystal Cathedral Ministries found itself facing a reality that once seemed unimaginable. The organization that had spent decades projecting strength, growth, and success was running out of options. Creditors needed to be paid, debts continued to mount, and there was no financial rescue on the horizon. Eventually, ministry leaders were forced to make a painful decision. The Crystal Cathedral campus would have to be sold. The announcement sent shockwaves through supporters around the world. For many, the Crystal Cathedral was more than just a church building. It was a symbol of possibility, faith, and the remarkable vision of Robert Schuller. Its towering glass structure had become one of the most recognizable religious landmarks in America. For decades, millions of television viewers had watched services broadcast from inside its sparkling sanctuary. Visitors traveled from around the world simply to see the building that had come to represent one of the most successful ministries of the 20th century. Several buyers expressed interest in the property, but one offer quickly emerged as the frontrunner. The Roman Catholic Diocese of Orange proposed purchasing the entire 34-acre campus for $57.5 million. After considerable deliberation, church leaders accepted the bid. One of the key factors influencing the decision was the diocese's commitment to preserving the property as a place of worship, rather than redeveloping it for commercial purposes. Even so, the sale marked the definitive end of an era. For more than 30 years, the Crystal Cathedral had stood at the center of Robert Schuller's ministry. It was the physical embodiment of his dreams, ambitions, and accomplishments. Every pane of glass, every service, and every broadcast reflected the vision he had pursued since his earliest days preaching from a drive-in theater in Garden Grove. Now, the building he had worked so hard to create would belong to another denomination entirely. The final Protestant service took place in 2013. Congregation members gathered for one last worship experience inside the sanctuary that had defined so much of their spiritual lives. It was an emotional occasion filled with memories, gratitude, and sadness. Many attendees understood they were witnessing the conclusion of a historic chapter in American religious history. Soon afterward, the remaining congregation relocated to a much smaller facility, leaving behind the landmark that had once drawn thousands every week. The Catholic diocese then began an extensive renovation project costing tens of millions of dollars. The building was redesigned to accommodate Catholic liturgy and traditions while preserving much of its iconic architecture. New religious artwork, symbols, and features were added throughout the sanctuary. Eventually, the Crystal Cathedral was renamed Christ Cathedral, officially beginning a new chapter under Catholic leadership. Robert Schuller lived long enough to watch much of this transformation unfold. In 2013, he was diagnosed with esophageal cancer, and his health gradually deteriorated. As he battled illness, he also witnessed the continued transformation of the ministry he had spent a lifetime building. The church, the campus, and even the building that had become synonymous with his name were all changing in ways he had never envisioned. The challenges became even more personal in 2014 when his wife, Arvella, passed away at the age of 84. Her death represented the loss of the person who had stood beside him from the very beginning. She had been there during the humble drive-in theater services, the rise of Hour of Power, the construction of the Crystal Cathedral, and the years of worldwide influence. Losing her was a devastating blow during an already difficult period. Less than a year later, on April 2, 2015, Robert Schuller died at the age of 88. Perhaps the most poignant detail of his final farewell was the location of his funeral. Because the former Crystal Cathedral was undergoing renovation, services could not be held inside the sanctuary he had spent decades building and promoting. Instead, mourners gathered outside. The man who had raised millions to construct the cathedral, preached from its pulpit for more than 30 years, and made it famous across the globe, could not be honored within its walls. Today, Robert Schuller remains buried on the same property where his greatest achievement still stands. Yet, the building above him now bears a different name, serves a different denomination, and represents a future he never intended. The Crystal Cathedral may still attract visitors and worshippers, but its story has become more than a tale of success. It is also a reminder of how quickly influence can fade, how fragile institutions can become, and how even the grandest visions can take unexpected turns. The rise and fall of Robert Schuller remains one of the most extraordinary and sobering stories in modern religious history. Robert Schuller changed American Christianity forever. His innovations in television ministry, church growth, and positive preaching influenced countless pastors who followed. Yet his story is also a cautionary tale about succession, family conflict, financial pressures, and the challenges of building a ministry around a single personality. The Crystal Cathedral still stands as a monument to both extraordinary success and heartbreaking decline. What do you think was the biggest reason for the collapse of Schuller's empire? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into history's most fascinating figures and controversies.